Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one pie.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach those who work remotely and those who hire them how to work better together. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by teammadeapart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free Best Practices Guide. One more thing before we kick off the show. Now, and for the foreseeable future, teammadeapart.com is offering free support and advice to remote workers and remote leaders alike through Team Made Apart Open Office. From noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, you can visit teammadeapart.com and navigate to the bottom left-hand corner of the page where you'll find a chat icon. Simply click it and you'll be connected to a real, remote work expert who is happy to help you solve problems in real time at no charge to you. Of course, you can use the same tool 24/7, 365 to ask questions or request services, but during open office hours, you've got a direct line of communication to people who care and people who can help. Once again, from noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, simply navigate to teammadeapart.com, find our chat icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, then click for instant support when you need it at no cost to you. Take advantage of this special program while it lasts, and now, back to the show. This week on the Team Made Apart podcast, we have very special guest, Laurel Farrer. Laurel is the CEO of Distribute Consulting and founder of the Remote Work Association. With a background in virtual operations management and as a global thought leader in the topic of remote work, Laurel collaborates with the world's top remote-friendly companies to strengthen virtual communication, streamline digital processes, and develop long-distance management strategies. Additionally, she writes about remote work for Forbes, is a subject matter expert for business education curriculum, and advises international governments, educational institutions, and industry associations on how to implement remote work processes to fuel socio-economic progress. Here for an exciting discussion on all that and more, please join me in welcoming our guest, Laurel Farrer. Hey, Laurel, thanks so much. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, really excited to have you. You're obviously one of the names that floats to the top when you start working around here in the remote workspace. And so I'm just excited as heck to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Great. Well, hey, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, sort of your background and how you got started in remote work at all?
Yeah, I actually come from operations management. So I became a remote worker when I took my own team remote 13 years ago. We were at a really critical stage of growth that we needed to save on real estate costs. And so the CEO and I decided maybe we should just try this just for a couple of months. So, it was not cool and exciting back then at all. We had to hide it from our customers and clients because back then you just would not be perceived as a legitimate company if you didn't have a physical footprint. And so we played it off as good customer service and let's go out for coffee or we'll meet you at your office or whatever. But we skidded by, and after a few months, we were just so impressed with the savings, with the increased productivity, with the employee retention that we just never went back. And so I just kept climbing the ladder in my own career as we do. And I was the CEO of a fully distributed company of about 500. And that's when I really saw a remote work done the wrong way. This was also the era of IBM and Yahoo retracting their policies. And so I said, wait a second. I'm an organizational development nerd. And so I was like, what's our pattern of success here? Like, how does a company make sure that they are doing this the right way and that they're becoming, the next Envision and Automatic and Microsoft, as opposed to the wrong way and becoming the next Yahoo? And so that's where I really dove deep into my career. And that was the birth of Distribute Consulting, which is a consulting firm that specializes specifically in remote work.
Yeah, that is so cool. And it's funny. I mean, I come to remote work sort of from a backwards perspective. So basically, I have been working, I run my own marketing advertising agency. We've been doing it for almost 20 years now. And it was started out of the back of a tour bus. Back in the olden days, I used to road manage bands and stuff like that. And I would sit in the back of the tour bus with my little BlackBerry Pearl and connect to 24K internet or whatever it was.
Yeah,
and
totally.
and do my best to work remotely, quote unquote, remotely. And so, it wasn't really until I started digging into this space that I understood sort of the differences, right? I don't come to it from a corporate background. I've always been hired by the corporations as a freelancer, but I've never come from it as a actual, real life employee working for a company remotely. And so there are nuanced differences. And I wondered, if you could sort of maybe, we don't have to go deep into what the differences are, but I wonder if you could sort of explain what is a remote worker. So when we're talking about remote workers throughout the rest of this conversation, what is it we're actually talking about?
Yes. The controversial question. So we're new in this industry, right? And so remote work as a broad term has been happening since the 70s. And so what is confusing a lot of people is like, here's this remote work revolution, right? We're hearing about it so much in the media and there's all these new initiatives. And so we're thinking, oh, it's new and exciting and trendy. But then we're hearing stories like yours and stories from other people that are saying, well, no, I've been doing this for 20, 30 years. And so it's like, wait, is this old? Is this new? What is it? So if we unify all of these terms, which is what we as advocates are trying to do, that we're siloing ourselves so much by saying teleworking is in the government space, telecommuting is in corporate enterprise space, remote work is in the startup and tech worlds, come on, like we need to unify. So yeah, if we unify all of those terms, then what it is any work model in which you do not need to commute to a centralized work location full time. So that opens it up much, much more broadly. And in that circumstance, that can include freelancers, whether they have a full-time job on site, but then, for their side hustle, maybe they're a remote worker. It can include telecommuters. It can include flexible working, like workplace flexibility or schedule flexibility. So there's a lot of terms that, if we bring them together, this is what it includes. Remote work is the broad umbrella, or it can be the broad umbrella, and partnered closely with flexibility.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Just because, for the last 15 years, I've called myself a digital nomad. And it wasn't until I got into this space at all that I realized, oh no, I am not a digital nomad at all.
Like, no.
I have nothing to do with that. I have a house payment. I have kids. I have nothing to do with that stuff, And so it's really funny because just as an outsider or as a person who was nomadic working, it felt like I was digital nomad, right? But I didn't realize how siloed, as you put it.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting. Kind of an eye opener anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's something we need to work to break down.
Yeah. Well, and I think the way that you summed it up, though, is really useful because it does allow everybody to sort of be encompassed, because the challenges of a freelancer and the challenges of a digital nomad in their relationship to work, and everybody else, that might be working remotely for a corporation or as a freelancer or whatever, we all share sort of similar problems. There might be some nuanced differences, but we have a lot more in common than we do apart. So I think
absolutely.
I think it's great the way that you summed it up. So tell me a little bit about the state of work as you see it presently, and sort of how you see distributed teams and co-working contributing to the future of work. Like, where are we going?
Yeah, well, a lot of people expect me to answer that question in the way that remote work is the future, right? I'm this huge advocate and have a voice in the world that says that talks about the benefits of remote work. However, my personal goal is not that remote work becomes the future. It is just that remote work becomes known as work. there is no difference between on-site work and off-site work. To coin, or not to coin the phrase, but to steal the phrase from Owl Labs, they had a big campaign in 2019 that talked about how location was irrelevant. And when they said that, I was like, yes, that's our messaging, that location is relevant. We want people to think about this in a way, just as we have other discriminatory factors, right? Like that you couldn't do equal work if you were a woman, or you couldn't do equal work based on your age or sexual orientation or race or whatever. We're saying, look, that's irrelevant. It doesn't, with the technology that we have now, the right processes, the correct infrastructure, when those are all created correctly, then your location becomes irrelevant. It doesn't matter where you are equally as capable of doing the same work as somebody that's in the office. So the offices were wonderful. We're not trying to paint the picture that it's like the big bad wolf, right? We're saying there's a time and a place for offices for sure, but for most knowledge-based work, you don't need to be in that location. And that's what we're just trying to drive awareness of, is that work is something that you do, not a place that you go. And that's the conversation that we want to be having instead.
Yeah, well, and I think that's great too, because, and I think we're maybe a little bit victim to the, aforementioned digital nomads, and that everybody's posting on Instagram the picture of work on the beach. You've got CEO sitting back in the office in his stuffy suit back in his office, and he's, going, oh, this is stupid. Well, of course, how could you get anything done? You're sitting on the beach enjoying yourself. Meanwhile, I'm here working. So I think this idea that, work isn't a place. It's like, everything you do, I think is a much better way of looking at this stuff, because I think that there really are camps, especially right now. It feels like for a lot of people, you're trying to convince people that you need to get into remote work. And I think it does come off sometimes, as you pointed out, that, you might be advocating for specifically remote work. Everybody needs to be remote, and this is the future. Instead of either in addition to, or as a part of, or, whether or not your presence in a building is relevant at all.
Exactly.
So I think that that's a really smart way of thinking about it, because there does seem to be some kind of divide, between traditional work, remote work, and like how they work together. Because I think some people do come at it from the perspective of, no, remote is the future. And I think the motivation has so much to do with that, from on the employer's end and the employee's side, in that, the workers, maybe they want to work from home because they don't like going to the office, or maybe they just, are lazy and want to sit at the house and they don't want to drive, for an hour or whatever it is. And, so they've got their own motivations, and then employers might be looking at it from other perspectives, where maybe it's real estate costs or utility costs, or, who knows. And, so I think it's really interesting to think of remote work sort of as this in addition to, or as a part of, instead of, this either or kind of scenario.
Exactly. Yeah. And to realize and accept the fact that each location in its own right can be leveraged. And so there are times that honestly, I wish that my team and I had an office. I really do. And I say that completely proudly, because there are times that I think, man, it would be so much nicer to just get together, get this done, have the standing appointment in person. We figure it out because we're a global team and we can't get together very often. And so we make do. But yeah, the more that we polarize between office versus offsite, the more that we shoot ourselves in the foot. So yeah, I think, and maybe this is a change of heart that I've had since working more with enterprise level clients, is the beauty of hybrid teams, right? So instead of 100% remote or 100% on site, the beauty of hybrid teams and not having a division of fully on-site and off-site people, but having fully on-site and off-site tasks. So what do we need to do together in the office, and what can we do apart? And just learning how to balance and really strategize asynchronous versus synchronous work.
Well, and I think, the same is true in real life, right? I mean, nothing is all one or the other. Everything is somewhere in the middle. And so while there are teams who've proven to be successful working remote, or fully distributed, like the automatics and stuff like that, I mean, those guys still get together, they still come together a few times a year, maybe they don't go to the same office, or maybe they don't see each other every weekend. But, nonetheless, they still recognize that seeing each other and developing relationships in person is still valuable.
Exactly.
And like we had another guest that will appear on this podcast that he was telling me, their full executive team is distributed everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But like when they come together like once a month. And when they're together, all they do is socialize. They just run around and go to dinner and meet the wives and hang out with the kids and stuff like that. But it's about developing those relationships in person because they can do their work from wherever. But to have a meaningful relationship, they actually have to spend time with each other.
Exactly.
Zoom
And
will get you so far.
Exactly. And as a consultant, that's exactly what I advise on so often is the problems that I see are because people have polarized in one way or another, whether it be with synchronous communication or it be with information security or it be with policies or whatever. Like they've polarized. They've thought of remote work as this completely extreme new work model. And it's like, oh, we have to do something so crazy. Like I'm never going to see anybody ever again, or I'm never going to do this or whatever. And it's like, no, it's not that at all. It's just integrating more virtual infrastructure and processes into the way that we already work. Like it's not that big of a difference. It is an intentional difference. We do need to make very subtle but critical changes in order to transition from physical mindsets to virtual mindsets. But this is not revolutionary. This is not groundbreaking. This is, frankly, it's the way that we're already working. Remote work is not the future. It's the present. And we need to just realize that it's already here. We just need to be doing it better.
Yeah, no, I think the key word you used there was intention, right? It's being intentional about it, recognizing, of course, I don't know anybody in any organization that doesn't occasionally work from home or, whatever, and they wouldn't consider themselves a remote worker per se, but of course they go off site all the time for things, meetings
Exactly.
or get-togethers or training sessions or whatever. They're always leaving work, and
right.
So
And even if we're in an office, right? Like how are we communicating with the person that is, 6 floors down? We're emailing them, we're pinging them on Slack, we're communicating with them in the exact same way as if they were 6 countries away. So, the processes are already there.
Yeah, no, I think that's great perspective. So to that end, then, a lot of the people that, you mentioned earlier, sort of this trend or this, that people are sort of looking at remote work like it's this great new trend. And it's this whole thing that now corporations have to, glom onto or they have to start grabbing either for employee retention or other things. But, how can we make it easier? Like, what's the incentive for a traditional co-located office to embrace remote if they don't already have policies in place to do so? And how does it actually help their bottom line to do this?
Yeah, so I love that you're bringing that up. It's the bottom line conversation because most people, when they say, I want to go remote and I'm going to convince my boss, my manager to let me work remotely, that's the mistake that they make is they go to their boss saying, this is going to change my life. I'm going to spend less time in the car. I'm going to have more time with my kids. I'm going to be able to travel more. Like this is how it's going to benefit me. And that is incompatible. You're asking a company to make a business decision based on personal criteria, and that doesn't match. So the more that we as advocates or we as just remote work hopefuls can start thinking about this remote work model as a business strategy, the more success we'll have in this conversion process. And that is speaking the language of business with business criteria, which is numbers, right? So we need to be talking about how this is going to benefit the business. So in that circumstance, there's tons of statistics out there from Gallup and Global Workplace Analytics or International Workplace Group and the U.S. Department of Labor. Like there's tons and tons and tons. But the best and most tangible benefits for employers are that it will increase productivity costs, right? We don't have the distractions of the office. We're able to get into deep headspace. So productivity costs are massive. Real estate costs are also really big. Employee retention, employee recruiting costs are much, much lower. It just goes on and on and on to the point that the average savings for a company to convert a role from physical to virtual is $11,000 per year per part-time worker.
Oh, wow.
And that goes, so obviously increased for full-time workers. But the data as it's presented is $11,000 is the minimum. That's huge.
Yeah, that's massive.
And
especially if you've got hundreds of employees, for example. It's impactful if you have 5 employees.
Exactly.
But if you had hundreds or thousands of employees, geez, you could, look at the savings.
Exactly. For any size of business, that's going to make a huge, huge impact.
Yeah.
So yeah, when we start having that conversation more about how this is good for businesses, then that makes it good for economy. That makes it good for environment. Like that, all of a sudden it becomes this very serious, strategic discussion, as opposed to like, I'm going to be able to sleep in for a half an hour longer. Like, nobody cares about that. That's not going to change the world. But what is going to change the world is stimulating our economy and really making long-term decisions that are going to revolutionize the way that we do business. And I think that's the side of the conversation that deserves more attention.
Well, yeah, and you pointed out in that, a lot of times it seems like instead of having this top-down discussion where corporations deciding to leverage remote work, a lot of times it is brought to them by the person who would prefer to stay home, or, somebody who's sort of looking out for number one, under the guise of looking out for number two,
Exactly.
And so it's kind of, it makes sense, but I wonder too, if that isn't why there's some resistance in the movement, like in getting, corporations to sign off, because they've got these perceptions. Everybody who's asked them to work remote is doing so for their own purposes, so that they can work from home, so they can be gone more often, things like that. But it's, I think it's really interesting to figure out how to manage that dynamic a little better, so that people, because, of course, remote workers are seeing this as something, or potential remote workers, we'll say, co-located workers, are looking at remote work as something they might like, that might be a good addition to their work. Maybe, it should be sort of integrated as a policy, but for an employee, it may be seen sort of as a perk. I get to work from home sometimes, things like that. So it helps the retention, it helps overall happiness. But how does an employee go to their boss and sort of introduce this idea if it's not being introduced? And I think you sort of touched on it, this idea of speaking sort of business lingo and making it more about the business than about yourself. But how do you, I guess, if you are to try and push that objective onto a business, is it easier to go that route, or is, I guess, is it better to go to your boss and ask for it, or to stand around and wait for it to show up? I guess what I'm getting to.
Yeah, well, that's a delicate question, right? So how I'll answer that is that proactivity is a critical skill for remote workers. This is statistically proven that if you don't have that ability to initiate something, you're really not going to do well as a remote worker. That's not to say that you can't, but obviously, like, we're very independent geographically as well as logistically. And so it's really critical that we have that self-starting skill. So that being said, I'll leave that for food for thought while I say that, yes, I would definitely recommend that you start the conversation. But again, start the conversation as a strategy for the business. So don't come about it in the way that it's going to benefit you. Come about it in the way that I have an idea that could really help our department, or I have an idea that could really help the company, and propose it that way. So the workflow that I traditionally recommend is that you come into the conversation very prepared. Because the automatic response from the manager, by the way, the most resistant demographic that is the greatest barrier to adoption is that mid-level manager, who is also the person that you're probably asking for permission from. So they are the ones that are dragging their feet the most. So it's going to be a tough conversation. So go into it prepared. So go do your research, figure out what those numbers are, and then go into your boss with a proposal and say, this is how I think that it would help our business, and really come in it thoughtfully. Maybe prepare like a one sheet with a case for change and say, based on the numbers that I'm seeing. By the way, global workplace analytics have calculators on how much your business could potentially save from going remote. So you can go in with those numbers and benefits and articles and whatever you think will help you, and say, here's a proposal. And then in that proposal, request a pilot. And that can just be 1 or 2 weeks that you say, let's test it, because nobody can say no to evidence. And so if it's all a theory, that's very easy to say no to, but nobody can say no to evidence. So initiate a pilot of just 1 to 2 weeks and just say, let's just try it and see what happens. If I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong. It is what it is, and I won't ask for it again. But I think that I can prove what I'm proposing to you in this one sheet. And then it should be pretty smooth sailing after that. If you're willing to be proactive, work hard, make that initial and intentional change that we talked about.
Yeah. Well, and I think, there's probably different levels of this. Some people may not feel empowered to have that conversation with a manager or whatever. So there may be other challenges to overcome. But I think that's great advice. So let's say, okay, I'm Mr. Middle Manager. I buy into the statistics, things like that you've given me. I've run it up the chain. Big boss man says, okay, well, let's check this thing out. So I'm a business looking to make the leap into leveraging remote work. Where would I begin? Because I understand too that this is a giant question, so don't feel like you need to check off every box. But there are a lot of considerations that I don't think people think of. I actually read an article where somebody was citing you actually, and they were talking about sort of like workplace regulations and OSHA and things like that and how it relates to your home office. And I've seen articles recently about, should your employer be paying for your internet if you're working from home and that kind of thing. So clearly this is a murky space. And even, to your idea of a pilot, right? What happens in that pilot if you get injured during your pilot or, there's so much stuff to pack into this thing. But if you were to sort of try and point me down a path, where might you point somebody?
Yeah. So it is absolutely critical that, and regardless of how you're starting this out, if you are going remote, that you understand and acknowledge and accept that it is not as simple as just sending your employees offsite. If you do that and just go about this the easy, organic way that just feels like it, makes sense. That's exactly what IBM and Yahoo did. And we can see where they are now, right? Like you have to have those very small intentional changes that will make this change sustainably. And so in that process, it's really critical to work with somebody that has been down this path before, because the big theme of going remote is that you don't know what you don't know. And so if you go remote, you don't understand how to prevent isolation. And frankly, you don't really understand that isolation is going to be a problem until it already is a problem. And same thing with compliance. Like you don't think about, are we non-compliant if one of my remote workers works from a co-working space? Like I didn't even think about that until you have a lawsuit on your hands. Mm-hmm. So it's really critical to work with somebody that knows what they're doing. Obviously, this is what I specialize in. I'm always happy to help with me and my team at Distribute Consulting. Like all of us have been doing this for years and years and years. And so we're on the other side. We've thought about this deeply and we can help. But at a very, very minimum, if you can't or don't want to hire a consultant, that's understandable. But at the very minimum, it's critical to get a remote work policy in place. That is the biggest mistake that most people make, is they just say, yeah, go work. But there's never any communication about what expectations are. And that is what goes wrong most of the time, is that the manager has one set of expectations, the worker has a different set of expectations, and there's just a giant miscommunication. So the manager thinks, yeah, you're going to be sitting at your desk from 9 to 5, just like you would be in the office. But then the worker's thinking, well, I'm flexible. Like I have workplace flexibility. I probably have schedule flexibility too. So it's not a big deal if I go pick up my kid at 3:00. Then the manager calls at 3 and there's a disaster, right? So it's just little conversations like that need to be had. So most of the time I think of myself as more of like a therapist than an actual consultant, because those are the conversations that I'm facilitating. It's like, okay, how are you going to ensure that your device is safe? And how are you going to make sure that their device is safe, and things like that. So there's a checklist that I have on my website. I give it away for free because I really feel that it's so important that everybody have a policy. So it's distributeconsulting.com/remote-policy. You can download it for free, and it is multiple pages, like everything that you need to consider in order to go remote. That puts you, both the manager and the worker, on the same page, and hopefully prevents a retraction in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, because I think that, like you mentioned earlier, sort of has been the recurring theme. It's this idea of intention, that you're doing this thing purposefully. It isn't as nonchalant as just sending somebody to work from home. You are intentionally modifying or changing or growing or evolving your business into something that now has a remote component. So just like you would if you were building a business that was non-remote, you would have policies for remote, in-house workers. So why wouldn't you have a policy for people who aren't working on site? It makes sense, but I can understand why people would just sort of easily make that transition into, oh yeah, you just don't have to come to the office every day, that kind of thing. It seems like it'd be pretty easy to miss stuff.
Yeah,
So,
it does. It seems so simple, but we just don't understand how complicated it is underneath.
well, and how much of it do you think? So, there's so much of this that is, tactical, right? You need to have policies. You need to be aware of the legal things and the regulations and things like that. But how much of it do you think, just to keep beating this idea of intention into the ground, I think not, your motivation for engaging in a remote policy, I think is really key, or is a critical part of this thing. Because I feel like if you come at it for the wrong reasons, either as an employer or an employee, you sort of open yourself up to some of these problems because it's the headspace you're in. So it seems like if you're not a particularly people-first organization, you might think you are, you might say the words out loud, but you don't really do it, or maybe you're working on it and you're not quite there, but you're trying to just save money or something, hey, I just got to get something off my balance sheet. So yeah, remote, right. That's great. Versus the idea that, I want to make people happier. I want to allow people flexibility. I want people to spend more time with their friends and family. I want people to, have a more fulfilled life, that kind of thing. It seems like those who sort of lead with this people first mentality, where they're actually trying to create a situation that's better for the people that work for them, and as a byproduct that happens to help the company, versus the class of people who everybody's competing to buy the best ping pong table so that we can sort of, all meet whatever the minimum viable thing is we should have to hire a new employee. Like it just seems like motivation is such a big part of it. What role do you think sort of people first versus, doing this either to catch a trend or for some sort of bottom line? Like how have you seen that play out in your consulting experience?
Yeah. So something that you'll hear very, very often in the world of remote work and like how to make remote work is the word trust. And so anybody, regardless of their motivations, can go remote and can be successful with the right information. However, what's really going to make that transition go much smoother is the shift in mindset methodologies and management strategies, right? Like that is really where you're going to see the biggest difference, because a lot of the infrastructure changes that happen that allow flexibility with communication channels and productivity tracking, they are based on results-based tracking, which means that you have to take your hands off of in-person supervision, obviously, and wait for the result to be delivered. So we have more trust with our workforce while they work autonomously and then return and deliver the results. And that can be a very big and scary jump for a lot of managers. This is exactly why we see the biggest resistance at that mid-level management in that profile and demographic is because of this, because their job is to completely control the results and make sure that all of the workforce is performing optimally, and then to turn around to the executives and provide all of those results to the business. And this is how the entire business is successful. So they are the most boots on the ground in terms of controlling the results. And to take that away and to ask them to, do that based on trust is extremely terrifying for a lot of managers, which is completely understandable. So the more that we can come into this change intentionally, with that people first mentality of saying, I'm going to empower my workers, I'm going to do this to benefit them, that really helps create that culture of trust. And as opposed to just meeting some, savings requirement or something and increasing quotas and whatever the goal is, because you're still going to be hyper focused on controlling the results. And that's the big change that needs to happen in order for a virtual team to be successful. So it's not impossible, but it really makes that transition much smoother if you can start with that factor of empathy from the beginning.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And empathy is a word that I throw around a lot, but I do really like, thinking about it more in the way you were, where it's not about empathy, it's more about trust. I mean, I think that the empathetic part in that, you care about your employer, they care about you. Like, I mean, I think it's, empathy is a good word there. But I definitely think that this aspect of trust and maybe relinquishing a little bit of control is probably, maybe a more business-centric way of talking about it. It's not as touchy-feely. It's much more, pragmatic.
Right. And it's not necessarily giving away the control. Oh, well, sorry, not eliminating the control. It's just delegating the control. I mean, this is autonomy, true autonomy, right? Is that we are giving the responsibility of controlling results directly to the worker that is creating them instead of to the manager. So the manager's role is now to support the worker as the worker controls the results. And again, like this is not revolutionary. This is not like, wow, remote work is going to come change the world. Like this is just good business. These are practices of empowerment and autonomy that we've been hearing since the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? So they're around. We just, in a virtual environment, have had to incubate them in a much more saturated timeline because we're required to. Like, we don't have another option of in-person supervision. Like, we don't have that. Like, we literally can't. So we're like, great, this empowerment sounds great. Let's do that 100%. So it's just it's a good incubator. It's a good case study of good business in general.
So we've been talking a little bit about how this is not, revolutionary. It's not the latest, greatest thing. This is something that's existed for a long time. Have you noticed, though, in your work in the space, an evolution, like maybe society is like getting to where we're now ready for it? Like, is that even a thing? Like, now we've got this sort of the Gen Zs and the millennial types, and they have sort of a different set of requirements than prior generations. And like, do you think that the space is a little bit more rife and ready for this kind of thing versus, 20 years ago? Like, I mean, it was obviously a different conversation, even in your own experience. When you first started into this space, it was a totally different conversation, like you're saying about having to sort of, I'll meet you at your place. Don't come to me, and it's funny because I even do that in my business now. Like, we always did the local coffee, whatever.
Totally.
And so, because, I don't have a space for them to come to. And so, but I mean, keeping up appearances feels like something that is a little bit dated. Like, it seems like some of this is less important now. And I wonder if you've just sort of noticed trends going that way, or noticed workforces going that way anyway. And then this is now more relevant than in the past, or it's becoming more relevant or more doable because global perceptions have changed. You don't get into a suit to get on an airplane anymore. Just we've evolved a little bit.
Exactly.
For the better or worse, you can argue, but
that's a different podcast episode.
Right. Yeah, we don't have time for that
one. Definitely. Like, this is absolutely changing, and it's a chicken and the egg too, right? Like, it's common. Is it common? But why is it common, right? Is it common because it's like, are we fueling the movement because the movement exists? Anyway, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to get all introspective here, but I would say the biggest fuel that we're adding to this fire is technology, right? Like, so back in the 80s and 90s, yes, telecommuting existed, but it was expensive. It was extremely, like, there was a lot of equipment that went into it. There was a lot of hardwiring that, anyway, it was a big, complicated setup. So only if you had a big enterprise employer or a very, very intentional knowledge about technology and equipment could you make that a reality in your life. And but now we all have the technology. Like, public Wi-Fi spaces are everywhere. I mean, my grocery store has a public Wi-Fi connection. Their Wi-Fi connections are everywhere. Tons and tons of people have smartphones. Like, this is just accessible. A mobile infrastructure, access to the cloud, access to the technologies that we need in order to work mobily. They're just, I don't want to say that they're a standard, but they're a much more common privilege than they were previously. And so therefore, we have a much more common ability. So that's where it's taken it into, this is not just a privilege for enterprises, but now this is something that just about anybody can do, whether you be a small business or a rural worker or an entry-level professional or whatever. Like, it's just much, much more accessible. And so I think that that's really what's spurring the movement.
Yeah, I think it feels like we're sort of arriving at a spot where sort of two timelines are coming together, and we're sort of at that crux of the position where it's this real sweet spot for remote work in terms of technology, sort of cultural norms and things like that, the way people are treating employees now versus, in the 30s when they were running you down the mine or whatever.
You're right.
We have different sensibilities now. And I think those different sensibilities in conjunction with great new technologies and, further more accessibility is definitely driving this thing. Mm-hmm. So speaking of that and access and things like that, one of the things that you're behind and that I'm actually participating in is this rural online initiative here in the state of Utah. Basically, I'm engaged presently with the leadership component of that program. But basically what you have is a course that teaches people in rural areas how to leverage remote work as a way to up their game or to find access to good work. Mm-hmm. And in this part of the country, I'm from Idaho originally, but here in Utah and Idaho, with lots of little towns, things like this. Mm-hmm. And beyond just little towns, I mean, I know that this isn't the objective of the ROI, but the ability to use these same skills to help people in underdeveloped areas or, third world places. Like, I mean, there's so much good that could be done, because of access and because of remote work. Those couple things can really be impactful to a society or all societies or a global society. And so I wonder if you talk a little bit about, the Rural Online Initiative as a program and programs like that where governments are sort of getting involved and seeing some real viability in this idea of remote work. Mm-hmm. And then how people can sort of, I guess, take those things or take those learnings to the next level and what to do with them.
Yeah, so we see a lot of problems with hyperurbanization, right? Regardless of where you are in the country, this is a major, major economic conversation that we have the urban areas that are really saturated in wealth and opportunity and job accessibility. And then we also have, this is comparison of macro and micro. Like in the United States, we have Silicon Valley versus, Wichita, Kansas, right? Like this is just a big conversation, but it's also a very small conversation just on the state level or even county level there's a standard, a geographical standard that you need to move to a certain area in order to have opportunity. And this has been happening for a long, long time. This is nothing new, but what is new is the ability to change that. And for the first time, maybe in history, we can take opportunity to people where they are instead of asking the people to relocate. And so it's a really exciting and very inspiring movement to be a part of, that we can say, man, we can alleviate transportation infrastructures. We can reduce discrimination and increase diversity and inclusion in workplaces. We can increase the quality of childcare. We can really do very important things by just shifting this mentality of you don't have to go somewhere for opportunity. Let's make the opportunity mobile instead of the people. So yeah, more specifically about the Rural Online Initiative, it's a very saturated experience in which we're doing exactly that and taking jobs to the residents of rural Utah and telling them exactly and training them how to, let me say this better. So we're educating them about what remote work is and then training them on the skills, the hard and soft skills necessary in order to participate in a virtual team, and then helping them get virtual jobs. And this is a massive economic development success story for Utah. It's only been going for just over a year, and we've had over 1,000 successful participants and have the job equivalent of, I can't remember the number. It's like over 7,000 jobs that have been created just by helping these people get remote jobs. So as a result of that, we are taking the program national and helping other communities around the country have access to the same program, and as well as by default, the same economic development success. And it's just insane to be a part of this and to be really having this much impact on the economy. What people can do in order to capitalize on it, obviously apply to participate, but then also just be creating a remote work ecosystem. I think that's a really big learning that I've had in the development of this program, is that the success of the program really depends on the success of a lot of collaborators, that it can't just be the workers, and it can't just be the government, and it can't just be the businesses, because we've seen that in a lot of different ways, right? We've seen tax incentives from other states and countries. We've seen remote work communities that are gathering, and everybody's still, action's not really happening. Success metrics are still lower than they'd like it to be. But when you get everybody in the same room, the government, the employers, the resources, the workers, everybody working collaboratively in the same space and in the same program, that's where you see the most success.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. And it's my story to some extent. Like I said, I started the business out of the back of a tour bus, but I lived in a little town, about 75,000 people. So it's not like little tiny rural city, but like for me in advertising and marketing, there was just no opportunity there. In fact, that's how we ended up in Utah, is I had to move to find a bigger agency that I could go work for.
Exactly.
And so even at that scale, even at 70, 80,000 people in town, like there's still not opportunity for everybody in every field. And so the ability to leverage remote, I'm not going to tell my wife about this too much because she might drag me back to Idaho, but
she's like, great, back up.
Yeah, cool. We can go back and be by our family again. But,
Yeah.
I think that that's something that's really important. And in fact, in some of the coaching work I'm doing now, I've got people in several different countries and sort of some repressed areas that are creative talent looking for remote work to try and pull themselves out of, really tough conditions. But it's funny, the similarities between them and the handful of people that I'm sort of coaching from small towns. Mm-hmm. And it's funny how, it's not all the same, right? Each person has their own challenges, but the problems in just finding good employment and being paid fairly and all that kind of stuff, it seems like the field can sort of be leveled a little bit by leveraging remote work. And so I think that, that's a big part of my interest in advocacy here is just trying to help make the world a better place for these people. How can these guys leverage something like that? Whether you live in, Nigeria or Chile or Bangladesh or wherever, how could you leverage remote work to make a better life for you and yours?
Exactly.
And so I think it's a pretty beautiful thing and very cool.
Yeah, we're seeing it with like refugees. How can we get virtual jobs to refugees? We're seeing there's a great remote work movement happening in Australia to help people that have been displaced because of the fires. The world just completely changes when we think about opportunity as a mobile concept as opposed to the people being mobile. It's really, it gives me chills every time I think about it.
Yeah, it's so cool. It really is. And I think it's honestly what's driving my work in this space is this idea of like, you could impact so many people positively by doing this kind of thing. And it's kind of there. Like you just have to coordinate it. It's already, people are already working towards this. But you could make, real meaningful change in a lot of places in a lot of parts of the world where, maybe opportunity isn't as present. So I think it's pretty great. So before we let you out of here, let me just kind of flip to the other side of the coin for a minute and just ask you a couple of thoughts of, if I'm a remote worker and I'm looking to get into work. We didn't get real deep into policy and problems like that, but I think as common as it is for a company to not think about remote work policies, it's probably as common for a remote worker or somebody who wants to be a remote worker to sort of just go work from home without putting any thought to policies or any of this other stuff, right? And so I wonder if you had any thoughts or just ideas that might help a remote worker, like if you're looking out for, a remote opportunity, or if you want to pitch this to your employer, how do you protect yourself? Like, what do you look out for, that's kind of in your best interest? Not to say that you're looking for a way to get a leg up on your employer, but like, how would you, go work from home, understanding that your relationship with your employer is secure and that the, protections that you have as an employee of said company are sort of in place?
Yeah, I think that can be a really great strategy. I should say the advice that I had for employers of how to go about this legally and sustainably is the exact same advice for workers. And I think that shows a lot of proactivity and a lot of responsibility. If a worker were to come to a manager and say, I have a proposal for this, I suggest a pilot, and I'll even draft a policy, like, I'm going to protect myself and I'm going to make sure that this is successful. That shows me as a manager that you're giving this thought, that this is a serious strategy, yes, but I can also trust you to do things independently. I didn't have to ask you as a manager to, well, have you thought about the policy? Have you thought about the HR implications? Like, you're thinking ahead, you're doing that proactively. So if you can show those skills, then I think that that's really critical. And when I say those skills, there's a lot. There's a report by Roberta Sawatsky, who's in the College of Okanagan College of Business. Yes, in Canada. We can link to it in the show notes. But she talks about exactly what those skills are, and it's proactivity and communication and empathy, and those skills are really what you need to develop in order to do this successfully. So I would start there as a remote worker. If you want to go remote, make sure that you have the skills necessary. It does not have to be meticulous organization. It does not have to be introversion. A lot of people think those. It's not that. It's just, are you willing to be in control of your own time and your own tasks and your own energy, which essentially just means, are you willing to be a self-manager? And if so, then you don't have to be managed in person. You can be successful in an independent environment. So start there. Make sure that you have the skill set so that when you go approach your manager with that proposal and that logistical preparation, you've also shown that you have the emotional intelligence to make this successful, and they know that they can already trust you.
I think that's really great advice. And you know, it's funny because you're almost doing both things at the same time. If you're having thoughts of introducing remote work policy, you're talking to your employer about it. Mm-hmm. Demonstrating those different soft skills that you're talking about by way of just making the introduction and by being proactive in the first place, which is probably something they've seen in your job performance anyhow, and sort of fits your personality. Like, it's interesting that the things that would make you the best remote worker are the things that you would need to have in place to become a remote worker. So exactly. I think it's, no sense in overthinking that. So cool. Well, so as we're getting to the end here, Laurel, where can people find out more about you, for one? And then, what resources or places can you point people to that you think would be valuable?
Yeah, definitely. So it's easy to find me on social media. I'm the only Laurel Farrer. So if you know how to spell my name, you should be able to find me. I'm most active on Twitter and LinkedIn. But then you can also find me anytime at my website, which is distributeconsulting.com. And that's where I help specifically business leaders make this transition very responsibly and sustainably, so that it's not a scary change. And that's where we provide analysis and resource creation and training for business leaders that are looking to capitalize on the benefits of remote work.
That's awesome. And also, I think you're also the founder of the Remote Work Association. Can you just talk about that real quick?
Yeah, the Remote Work Association was a very accidental creation. It was there was a lot of thought leaders like myself that we all feel very passionately about remote work, and so we would get together at conferences and we would see each other and be so excited. And in the green room, we would be like, "Oh, have you heard about this? And have you heard about this?" Like, there were so many things that were happening deeper, in the bowels of remote work that we weren't talking about on the stage. And so I just said, man, I love these conversations. Like, I live for these. I learn so much about what's happening behind the scenes. We really need a channel to be able to discuss these. And heaven knows remote workers do not need one more Slack channel. So I was like, let's do this like in a more saturated experience. Let's just do like a virtual roundtable once or twice a month and just like get together and share deeper conversations like this, like economic development and refugees and policies and stuff like that. The unsexy stuff that nobody's talking about. And so, yeah, we got together, we started doing that, and it kind of just, more people kept hearing about it, and they were like, "Oh, you should join this," and "Hey, hey, have you heard about this?" And it just kept kind of growing and bigger organically. And so now it's hundreds and hundreds of people that get together, and we just talk and think about remote work at this deeper level, and it's a lot of fun. So yeah, if anybody'd like to join us for these conversations that are business leaders or just advocates or want to be remote workers, anybody's welcome to join us. It's completely free and virtual.
Awesome. Cool. And I think that's remoteworkassociation.com if you want to check that out. So Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time, Laurel. I know you have a busy schedule today, so thank you so much for making time for me.
Thanks so much, Ryan.
Cool. Thank you. Appreciate your time. Take care.
You too. Bye.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you anything.